All right, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you all for attending today's webinar hosted by the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. Today's webinar's topic is our approach to strategic planning. We want to ensure that all of you are strategically planning in a turned outward way. So we're going to get started. And I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Colleen Bowman, who is the Director of Network Engagement here at the Harwood Institute.
Great. Thanks so much, Damien. And good morning, everyone. I see we have people from around the country joining us, which is really exciting. And before we officially kick off, I just wanted to share a couple of updates with you all really quickly. So if you haven't been to our website recently, definitely go and check it out. We recently redid our website and would love to have your feedback and thoughts. And I want to direct you specifically to harwoodinstitute.org/libraries. It has some great case studies and information, trainings, resources, events that you can sign up for. That's going to be your one-stop shop for all things library related. And we also have another webinar scheduled this year, November 8th. It's going to be about libraries and authentic community engagement. So be sure to register for that and reserve your seat. And then I also want to make sure you're aware of our upcoming lab for libraries on October 9th through 11th in St. Louis. The Harwood Institute has trained over 4,000 library professionals in our practice of turning outward. So if you want to join that cohort of librarians and library professionals around the country who are impacting their communities, be sure to reserve your seat at that upcoming lab. Of course, if you have questions or concerns, my contact information is on the slide that you're viewing right now. Feel free to reach out to me. Happy to help with anything. And also want to make sure if you missed our last webinar in June 2018, the harwoodinstitute.org/libraries page has a recording, so you can go back and review that and learn about creating more effective library programs. And two things I just want to mention quickly that aren't on your slide, but I want to make sure I bring your attention to, is if you receive our newsletters, you probably saw Rich Harwood is launching a speaking tour about finding dignity, hope, and community in America today. We hear a lot from our partners on the ground about how they are frustrated with how divided and polarized our communities are. And so this speaking tour is a great way to mobilize your community and get them on a path towards hope. As of today, we've heard from over 30 organizations who want to host Rich. They're from numerous states. We've heard from Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, California, Connecticut, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, Maine, North Carolina, Nebraska, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin. So if you are in one of those states, and I know some of you are based on your chat, definitely reach out to me, and we'd love to bring this tour to your community. If you didn't hear your state and you want to be added to the list, again, let me know and we can talk about bringing Rich to your community. And then the final update I just want to give you real quick. This year's 2018, the Harwood Institute will be celebrating our 30th anniversary, which is incredible, and we want to help honor those public innovators like you all on this webinar who are committed to turning outward and creating positive lasting change in their community. So our 30th anniversary is all about showing people that we know we can get things done together. The work that you all do is so inspiring, and excuse me, we want to make sure to share your story. So if you have been using the Turned Out practice and want to be featured in this celebration, send me a quick email or give me a call and we can talk about your story.
All right, thank you, Colleen. I hope you all have time to respond to Colleen's updates. Her email is listed here on the slide in front of you. So please feel free to reach out to Colleen or call us at the office if you have additional questions or if you want to respond to those prompts there. So we're just going to take a step back and we're going to go over our agenda for the day. So today's webinar will cover the following three areas here. What it means to be a library that is turned outward, steps for strategic planning, tools for for turned outward strategic planning. And so we'll go over those briefly. But before we dive into those various areas, Colleen's going to lead us in a short exercise to get us talking and thinking about what it means to be turned outward with regard to our orientation as individuals and as libraries.
Great. Thanks so much, Damien. So I wanted to just launch this discussion real quick. If you have worked with us before, you've probably heard about this turn quiz, and it's a short quiz that we use to help assess whether you are turned outward or turned inward. And one of the questions on that quiz is whether you are using your organization or your community as a point of reference when creating your strategic plan. So I want to start this by, in the chat, let's start answering this question. So if you could enter whether, if you're considering your organization, if your community, just want to start by assessing where we are generally focused on. So if you could just start entering in the chat, am I generally focused on my organization or my community? Great. So Jean says her community, Roberta, my community. Dodie, we focus on our community at the Denver Public Library. Yes, you do. We've done some great work with the Denver Public Library. Helen, organization. Paris, appreciate your honesty, organization. And so as you can see, there's a couple community, a couple organization. Amy, community. Stephanie, our community. Heidi, organization. But we want to change that. Yes, absolutely. So that is what turning outward is all about. But it really starts with honestly assessing yourself if you're generally focused on your organization or your community. Some of both. Suzanne says some of both, but want to look more to the community. Absolutely. That's great. Okay, so definitely start thinking about that. Ask yourself the question, am I generally focused on my organization or my community as we move through this process?
Okay, so for those of you who mentioned organization, or even some of you who mentioned community as your kind of where you're generally focused, I would recommend that you go onto our website and take some time to review the webinar from June, which essentially asks questions around how to create programs that are turned outward. And that would be a helpful start. But as far as the strategic planning piece goes, we're going to get started with that right now. So strategic planning is an organization's process of defining its strategy or direction and making decisions on allocating its resources to pursue its strategy. And so what we want to talk about first is what it means for a library to be turned outward. Let's just click here. So these are the characteristics of a turned outward library. A turned outward library uses the community as the reference point for choices and actions. So in the last slide, the last exercise that from the turn quiz that we just kind of engaged with Colleen, we asked the question, are we generally more focused on our organization or the community? And it seems like the greatest desire from most of those who commented is to be more focused on the community. And so for a library to operate in a turned outward way, it uses the community as a reference point for the choices and actions that it makes or takes. Additionally, a turned outward library creates programs and strategies that are rooted in the public knowledge of the community. Many of you who are trained public innovators are familiar with public knowledge, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And the last characteristic here of a turned outward library is an essential piece. Not that the public knowledge is just nice to have, but it's a part of the community. So the goal for libraries really should be to be centering communities as a part of your decision-making, as a part of the choices that you make and the actions that you take, centering public knowledge as a way of grounding your programming, and to ensure that you have placed community at the center of everything that you do. And so much of our practice is shaped around centering community voice as a means of making strategic decisions about libraries. So next, we're going to give you an opportunity to, what we normally do is a voice from the field, but we have a very captivating new video that speaks to what it means to be a turned outward library, particularly with regard to strategic decision making and using public knowledge as a way to ground programming. So we're going to get that video started here. Please excuse our kind of working on some logistics. So we're going to put us on mute, and then we're going to allow our video to kick in just a second. And once the video is completed, we'll just open again the chat box for you guys to respond to the video. Colleen's going to lead in with some questions about the video, and we will go from there.
If there were only one word that I could use to associate with the Harwood Institute, that word would have to be community. When I attended that first Harwood lab for libraries, I had never heard of Harwood, never heard of the Harwood Institute, had no idea what it was all about. It was probably the single most impactful professional development experience that I've ever had. The idea that all you have to do is ask someone about their aspirations for their community, and you can learn some very powerful things, was just very enlightening to me. And we had one conversation, and two, and then six, and then a dozen. And every single time we did it and asked those questions again, people began talking about the same issues, such as the idea that people in Oak Park are very interested in a very diverse and welcoming and equitable community, or the feelings that people have around an increasing lack of safety. Before engagement with Harwood, we thought about library safety and rules of behavior in a very traditional way. And today, because of the things that we've learned, we employ a full-time social worker at the library who leads a social services team and a safety team around the issue of people in the community experiencing homelessness, people who are living in poverty, people who, because of barriers around immigration status or language, need more assistance to understand how the community works. Now, instead of agencies thinking about the library as just a place for people to go, we are, and our team are recognized now as participants at those tables, and indeed even leaders in those conversations, which is wonderful. Changing the culture of an organization is a very challenging thing. I had board members questioning what we were doing and why, and what this necessarily had to do with a library. It was after slowly people seeing the impact that it was having that people started to appreciate the power behind it. I would say that this idea of turning outward has permeated the whole organization. We have people doing every kind of job and at every level of the organization who now know and understand what does turning outward mean. And I've never in my entire career felt as positive about the work and have been as motivated and energized about the work as I have in these last few years. I'm very grateful to Rich Harwood and to all the people that work for him in really changing my life.
Great. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that video. I know it's a really compelling story of the Oak Park Library and how they are a turned outward library. And, you know, turning outward is a practice that's been built over our past 30 years of work. And there's essentially 5 key elements to turning outward, but the first is knowing what matters to people. Because in order to build a strategic plan and programs that are effective and resonate within your community, you have to know what your community aspires to be, what members of your community are concerned about. So I just want to ask in the discussion for you to reflect a little bit about if you think you know what matters to people. You can just type a yes or no or need to know. Would love to hear what your thoughts are. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, if you do know, you know, one thing that was striking about the Oak Park story is that they learned about the safety concerns in their library, which then led to an organizational change within their library that helped better meet the needs and concerns and goals of their community. So first question is, do you think you know what matters to people? Second question is, what are those aspirations or challenges that your community is facing? So whenever you're ready, just take a minute and enter in the chat. If one of you feel like Stephanie says, I feel like I know some, they want a safe, welcoming community. Absolutely, Stephanie, that's something a lot of communities are working for. Denver Public Library takes a boots on the ground approach to learn what each district community needs and wants. 26 branches and 26 communities, that is a lot of work, but I'm sure you've all seen how critical that is to gaining that knowledge in order to create more effective programs. Yes, we know, but always good to inquire and learn more. That's great to hear, Ramona. Damien's going to talk more about specific things you can do to create better what we call public knowledge. Community needs to move past, oh, this is coming in fast. Place for middle school kids, after school. Yes, no, and maybe, in a general sense, assumptions, absolutely. So I think turning outward is moving away from assumptions and towards garnering public knowledge so you can be more firm in your convictions and more firm in your strategic planning to make sure it's effective. Serves an aging town, anxious to maintain our heritage but grow with the changing times. Suzanne says, I know it matters to people who use the library but have little to no idea about those who don't use the library. So that's another thing, Suzanne, a critical part of turning outward is creating allies within the community that might be outside of the normal realm of people you deal with. And Damien's going to go into that as well, how you can start engaging those folks that might be outside of your reach. We've learned, Krista says, we've learned that our community hopes for a central hub for trusted information, safe spaces, more services for our Spanish-speaking communities, and access to resources. Absolutely, Krista. That's great to hear. All right, so thank you all for noting about, you know, how you're thinking about your strategic planning, reflecting on what you know, if you know what matters to people and what those things are, what does matter to people in your community. And now I'm going to turn it over to Damien to start diving into the how. So if you're looking to better discover what matters to people, if you're looking to, you know, build up your strategic plans, I'm going to turn over to Damien to dive into deeper details.
Okay. So we'll just get started here. All right. So strategic planning and the steps. So for many of you, you have engaged a strategic planning process. And for us, we use these 4 steps as a way of discussing how the practice can be applied to strategic planning. And these steps that you have listed in front of you are some very simple, basic steps that many organizations use as a kind of process-oriented way into strategic planning. So those steps you'll see on your screen. Number 1 is gathering input and reviewing data. The second step is setting direction and goals. The third is identifying strategies. And the fourth is developing targets and metrics. So as we go into the next phase of this presentation, I will be mentioning quite a few tools that are part of our practice, but all of those tools can be found on our website. So please feel free to visit the website for the tools that I mentioned. Additionally, at the end of this presentation, you all will receive a recap email, and that email will contain the recording and the PowerPoint, as well as the tools that I will mention today. Okay, so let's dive in. Gathering input and reviewing data. So many of you may be familiar with this step in the strategic planning process. Often at this step, planning uses expert knowledge to look closely at data and metrics that show what is happening with the library services and what's also happening in the context of community. At this phase, you may also include generally, it may include focus groups and or interviews as a strategy for gathering input from constituents and library users. These are all useful ways of looking at libraries. But from a turned outward perspective, this is the perfect time at this step to layer in public knowledge. And we'll get a little bit, we'll go a little bit further into what public knowledge is a little later. Many of you are already familiar. But at this step in the strategic planning process, it would be good to layer in some public knowledge to the discussion and to talk about the community context as a part of the library situation. All the public knowledge gathering tools are on our website, but I'll just list those tools. Community conversations, that's a tool that can be used to gather public knowledge. Our Ask tool, that can also be used to collect public knowledge. The Aspirations exercise, also available on our website. And then we have a tool that helps you summarize the information that you collect. And then there's a process for sharing public knowledge. So if we can just briefly go through each of these tools, I'd just like to give you kind of like an appetizer into what that looks like and how, what kinds of questions these tools ask, so that you can understand the rhyme and reason behind why possibly including public knowledge at this step in your strategic planning process would be helpful and important to how you ground the work of your library. So in the context of the community conversations, there's a series of questions that are asked, and they're all important. They play a role for understanding and being able to gather together public knowledge. Together, these questions help to produce a deep understanding of community. So one of the questions, the first question actually is, what kind of community do you want? So in the community conversation, if you pull that tool, you'll see that that first question is really important, because this is where people will start to name their aspirations. They'll also tell you why it matters, and you'll begin to have words to describe the community-based, context-specific words to describe the community. The second question is, given what we just said, in relationship to question 1, what are the 2 to 3 most important issues or concerns when it comes to community? This particular question gives people room to tell their story. Those stories will be really important for understanding your next steps with regard to thinking about programming and how to ground your work in community desire and aspiration. The third question is, what concerns do you have about this issue and why? Here, you can learn a lot about how people talk about the issue, what words they're using. That's very important for being able to create and produce public knowledge that is broadly understood by the community that you're serving. as a matter of a ground rule here, you generally don't let anyone dominate the conversation at this phase. So these are just the first 3 questions that are part of our community conversation guide. And I would recommend that you pull that tool and engage it as you venture off into community conversations, or if you have had community conversations and are thinking about having additional ones, this tool will really be helpful in that regard. The second tool that I mentioned was the Ask tool, the Ask and the Aspirations exercise. The Ask tool is ideal for engaging individuals in a quick 3 to 7 minute interview. So it works especially well for individuals on the local streets, at the malls, at conferences, over the phone, or elsewhere. And it's just a series of short questions. You can pull that from our website as well. The Aspirations tool is ideal for helping to shift the frame of reference for an organization or organizations to the community, and to uncover the conditions that need to change in the community to make progress, as well as what steps are needed. So it especially works well with organization staff, a particular department, senior staff, etc., partners, a group or coalition of organizations, or a broad board or steering committee. So those 2 tools, the Ask tool and the Aspirations exercise, they are uniquely suited for individuals as well as organizational staff in the event that you need to collect, to gather just, information around what the community is aspiring to outside of the context of the community conversation. And another very important piece of collecting public knowledge is being able to summarize it in a way that is comprehensive and cohesive, and tells kind of a well-rounded story. So part of what we provide for the summarizing of those conversations is what we call a Mad Lib format. So essentially it flows in this way. People want XYZ, so that's where you name their aspirations, but they're concerned that, and then you list their main concerns. And those concerns are generally in the way of achieving the aspirations that those individuals or groups have. As people talk about those concerns, they talk specifically about XYZ. They believe we need to focus on XYZ actions, and if X group played a part in those actions, they would be more likely to trust the effort and step forward themselves. Again, this particular tool can be found on our website as well. And sharing public knowledge, another tool that is on our website. There's some guidelines to that that are part of that tool. But sharing public knowledge that you can learn from community conversations with other individuals, organizations, and groups is an important way to create community ownership of people's shared aspirations and concerns. It also paves the way to create alignment in people's intent to take action where the reference point for action becomes the community. What follows is, so there are guidelines for sharing public knowledge, 2 different options to present public knowledge to others, and questions for engaging others in a conversation when sharing public knowledge. And this is a part of the tool. So those guidelines are as follows. Create room for learning. You want to create room for people to hear about and understand what you are learning from the community conversations. This means don't jump to solutions too quickly where people lose sight of what is being learned. So creating room for learning. Keep it simple. So this goes back to the conversation that we were having around the community conversations and being able to record the language that community is using. This is very important. A good place to start is to frame what you learned in terms of people's shared aspirations and their common concerns. Make sure not to give a long laundry list of findings. You'll lose people. Keep it short and simple. Focus on moving forward, very essential. Action is the orientation of the practice. The practice is meant to reorient organizations and individuals to be focused on action. Earlier in the presentation, we talked about, are you focused on your organization or your community? And then in the prior presentation on programming, we talked about people versus programs. But one of the other prompts in our turn quiz is activity versus action. And that sits at the center of most of what it means to be turned outward, to be action oriented. So keep focus on moving forward with regard to sharing public knowledge. It's important to generate a discussion around what it means for what this means for moving forward. Thus, never use the public knowledge as a means by which to point fingers at someone or some group for failing to take certain actions or produce certain results. This is the fastest way to make someone defensive and push them away. The other pieces here are get a good agenda spot. When engaging people on what you learned, ensure that you're not the last agenda item. Too often, you'll be rushed because the meeting is running late. So that's kind of just a principle here for how to run the meeting. And then recruit the right people. If you want action to be taken or a decision to be made, make sure key decision makers are involved. Being able to curate the conversation in a way that you have decision makers and community members in conversation so that you can push forward an agenda is really important. So that's the first step, gathering input and reviewing data.
And before Damien just moves on to the next slide, I just want to add real quickly, if you are currently hosting community conversations, if you're using the Ask tool, which is something that you can do today, if you have 10 minutes, you can use the Ask tool today, right now. I encourage you to post about what you're learning on social media, use the hashtag #TurnOutward, tag us in your posts. And the reason I make that ask is because if we want to create change on a larger scale, create positive lasting change and move against these divisive trends that we're seeing in our community, we need to all be talking about the work that we're doing to create that movement. So if you're on this webinar, you want to create a better community and a better society. So we want to help support you in your efforts to do that. So definitely let us know what you're up to, and we can help share your story and your work.
All right. So we're just going to shift over to the next slide here. So this would be step 2 in the strategic planning process, setting direction and goals. So the 2 tools that we will reference here are the 3 A's and the sweet spot. When working on clarifying organizational direction and setting goals for the library, the turned outward mindset can help you look for opportunities to deepen impact and to become more relevant to the community. Think about the 3 A's. For those of you who are familiar, you would just ask simple questions. How are you currently doing at reflecting them in the work of the library? How can you increase and strengthen these dimensions? And if we just take a quick tour of the 3 A's, based on years of research and work, the Harwood Institute has developed a set of touchstones for thinking about and making daily choices when it comes to being turned outward. We call these touchstones the 3 A's. Many of you may be familiar, and some of you may have this tool pulled up currently. And those 3 A's are authority, authenticity, and accountability. Each of these A's comes with its own intentionality test. So for instance, authority. The intentionality test for authority is, could I stand up on the table and reflect back to people in the community their shared aspirations and concerns? And would they believe you? So with regard to setting direction and goals, authority is kind of one step in the 3 A's of public life for thinking about how to set direction and how to name goals. In our daily lives, to hold authority means to hold a deep knowledge of the community, people's lives, aspirations, and concerns, and to actively apply knowledge about the community to the work we do. The second A is authenticity, and the intentionality test there is, do I reflect the reality of people's lives, and do they believe I have their best interest at heart, even when we disagree? So in our daily lives, to be authentic means to reflect the reality of people's lives and what we do and say, see and treat people as citizens, members of the larger community, rather than only consumers or donors or members. And the last piece here is to deeply listen to the community in an ongoing way. So, so that our strategic planning isn't a kind of a one-time thing, and we're kind of gauging throughout the life of our strategic plan what shifts we need to make. We need to make sure that we are present in community in a way that they know we're authentically concerned about what they're concerned about. And the last A is accountability. And the intentionality test there is, am I living up to the pledges and promises I've made? And what this means is that you set realistic expectations about potential impact of the work and promises made to people in the community. Pursue actions that are meaningful to people, avoid window dressing, and build on what comes before and create a foundation for what might follow. So those are the 3 A's in a nutshell. And again, that particular tool can be found on our website, as well as all of the ones that I mentioned today. The next piece here is the sweet spot. The sweet spot is where you take action on a public concern and simultaneously build the underlying conditions for change and sustainability. The key is to determine which community conditions need to be strengthened and or created in order to make progress on the concern you have been identified to take action on. So if it were overlapping circles, essentially the overlapping portion would be the sweet spot, where issues and concerns come together with community conditions so that you have the perfect opportunity and kind of ideal conditions to be able to take action on the concerns of the community. That tool also is available on our website, and I'll keep repeating that just for you all so that you can use that as a point of reference. So far we've gone over 2 steps in strategic planning. The first being gathering input and reviewing data. And there we have suggested that you use your public knowledge. And the second is setting direction and goals. And here we are suggesting that you use the 3 A's and the sweet spot as reference tools in your strategic planning. The third step is identifying strategies. And here we recommend being very clear about your community rhythms, right? And so this is the tool that we advocate to be used here at this step in strategic planning. So in identifying strategies, you want to start your effort to set strategies by revisiting community rhythms. For those of you who are familiar with the practice who have been to a Public Innovators Lab. And it simply asks a few questions. Given what you learned in gathering public knowledge, what stage do you sense the community is in? When you think about the stage you are in, what strategies make sense for that stage? And here you can use the do's and don'ts chart that are part of the community rhythms tool. Again, you can pull that from our website. And just to give you some examples of the do's and don'ts, for instance, if you're in the waiting place, you want to be careful not to inflate expectations by announcing grand plans. So what do? You create forums for conversations and interaction where people feel they belong and crystallize feelings of frustrations. What to think about? Do you really know how committed your partners are? So again, on the do's and don'ts tool, you can review, based on the public knowledge that you've collected, where your community is, the waiting place, the impasse stage, catalytic stage, the growth stage, sustain and renew stage. And based on your the information that you gathered and what you determined with regard to the stage of your community, the do's and don'ts tool really helps you navigate how to engage community given its location. The next piece here is that you would look at the strategies that are emerging in the planning. How well do they fit with your stage? How might you adjust them to take into account the insights you have about your community? So these are all kind of, after you revisited the community rhythms tool, questions that you may want to ask yourselves. Next, you want to review your public knowledge summary and look at the authority, authenticity, and accountability tools again. So the 3 A's. Ask yourself if the new strategies reflect public knowledge. And naturally, if they do not, you revise your strategies. And if they do, you also want to think about, based on the information that you collect, you may want to revisit or revise your strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to add and really reinforce this point that developing strategies, you need to develop strategies that meet your communities where they are, not where we want them to be. So keep in mind the goal and the aspirations, but you also have to reflect on which stage your community is currently at and develop strategies that reflect that stage. That's the only way you're going to make progress. So I just want to hammer that point home, that it's about developing strategies that meet communities where they are, not where we want them to be.
Yes, thank you, Colleen, for that. It's very important, and it reflects your embrace of the public knowledge and what you've learned and taken away, and your respect for the community. So we're just going to shift over to the last step here, which is developing targets and metrics. Here again, you can use the 3 A's and making meaning of data. The Making Meaning of Data tool is available on the ALA website. So it's easily Googled. You can go into your Google bar or your search engine, whatever that may be, and type in ALA, Making Meaning of Data. And I will leave that to you all. But to revisit the 3 A's here, and the final parts of strategic planning for an organization, most organizations often identify key targets and build dashboards to collect metrics and track progress. So many of you are familiar with that. As you do this, use 2 tools, the ones that I mentioned, the 3 A's tool and the Making Meaning of Data tool. When you use the 3 A's tool and the discussion questions that are associated with it, this will help you stay grounded and choose useful metrics for aligning your targets and understanding how to define metrics. And it also allows you to choose useful metrics to align to community perspective. I would recommend that you all take an opportunity to download the Making Meaning of Data tool that again is on the ALA website, and we provided a link here at the bottom if you just want to kind of copy and paste that or just enter it into your search bar. And for that tool, there are a few assumptions that it lists in the outset. And the assumptions about libraries using the tool is that you have been oriented in the turning outward practice of the Harwood Institute. You have conducted community conversations and created a public knowledge summary. You have a basic knowledge of public capital factors before beginning the discussion. And that's a part of the tool you can reference there. You use data to track different elements of the library programs and services. So you have some existing tracker or kind of metric set to determine how impactful the work you're doing is in the context of library. And the last piece here is that you want to connect the expert knowledge embedded in data about the library with the public knowledge you gain from the community. So these are the kind of assumptions going into your use of the Making Meaning of Data tool. The goal of the tool is really to connect data and metrics to public knowledge and public capital factors to create alignment and practices. For most of you who are going into a strategic planning process, you ultimately want to know that whether or not the programs you've created or developed as rooted in public knowledge are impactful and they're making a difference in the ways that you would hope. And so you want to have some means to measure that, as do many organizations. So again, you can visit the ALA website to review that tool. So just briefly, I'll just kind of go over the steps again that we outlined here today for strategic planning. And then we will conclude our webinar today. So if we can just go back here. So the first step here is gathering input and reviewing data. And here, again, we recommend that you use your public knowledge, or that you apply public knowledge at this phase of your strategic planning. For more information on public knowledge, again, you can visit our website for the public, the tool that's associated with sharing public knowledge and collecting public knowledge. There are a few elements here that we've mentioned: the community conversations, the Ask tool, the Aspirations exercise, the summarizing tool, which is called MadLib, and then sharing public knowledge. All of those tools are available on our website. The second step here is setting direction and goals. Here you can apply the 3 A's as well as the sweet spot. These tools are available on our website and are extremely helpful in understanding what position you hold, and then strategically how to plant your programming in the context of your strategic plan. Identifying strategies. Here we recommend the use of the community rhythms tool, which essentially helps you locate your community, what the status of your community is, where are they, and then align your programs and your strategy in a way that reflects the life stage of your community. And the last step here is developing targets and metrics. Again, the 3 A's and the tool that we have here that's on the ALA website, making meaning of data. But these 2 tools together helps you get an understanding of essentially how to measure the impact of your programming, and how to kind of frame in the context of impact, how you're going to assess the effectiveness of your program in the context of your strategic plan. So now we want to open up the box for questions. If you have any, we're here to respond to questions.
So as Damien said, definitely feel free to add some questions to the chat box. We are happy to answer any questions you have. While you're thinking of questions to ask, one thing that I want to make sure you're aware of as well is that as you're developing these strategic plans, as you're working through challenges in your community and trying to create lasting positive change in your community, I want you to know you're not alone. You're part of, we've trained 4,000 library professionals in the practice of turning outward, and there are numerous libraries and communities around the country, and rural, urban communities as well, of all different sizes, who are working to make this positive change. And I know we have some folks from the Denver Public Library on, as I believe we have some folks from Skokie Public Library as well. And these 2 libraries have formed a community of practice with other libraries in their area who are implementing the Harwood practice. And it's a space for them to share best practices, what they're learning, the challenges that they're facing. So if you are doing this in your community too, let me know, because we want to share stories like this to help folks better implement the practice of turning outward. And if you want to learn how to start a community of practice in your area, feel free to send me an email. I can help connect you with those Skokie and Denver folks who are already doing this great work. So we know that working in communities can be tough and challenging and at times, and we want to be here to support you in your efforts.
Yes, and I echo Colleen, and we look forward to seeing if you guys have any questions. But I know that strategic planning can be a daunting process, but again, the practice is really meant to move your conversations, particularly around strategic planning, from the boardroom to the community. So the goal really is to ground your planning and the aspirations, desires, and hopes of the community as a means of having impactful and meaningful programs that are effective and that actually meet the needs of those in your communities. And so I suppose that many of you signed on today, understanding that that is kind of the ultimate goal of the Institute here, is to really get folks turned outward and to ensure that organizations are turned outward and operating in ways that are turned outward. And the tools that we mentioned for each step of the strategic planning process will really be useful and meaningful in helping you do that as you endeavor to engage strategic planning processes in your libraries. So given that we do not have any questions, we're just going to transition to our last slide here, and I'm going to let Colleen lead us in that.
And it looks like Jean did ask a question. Will the recording have a narrative included? I'd like a listing of recommended steps with corresponding tools. We can certainly, so after the webinar concludes, we're going to be sending a recap email, which will have the webinar recording, these slides, which outline the different steps, and we can also provide links to the corresponding tools. So yes to your question, Jean. And then Heidi said, we're just getting started. What kind of time frame should we plan for? We realize this culture change will take time.
Yeah. So for the strategic planning process, it varies from one organization to the next. So you may want to consider the phase and stage of your organization and community as a means of setting a realistic timeline around when you can produce your strategic plan. Some organizations, they have internal goals, so it's really set by the board, but how you do that should really be grounded in community, and that should be factored into an ongoing timeline to ensure that if you do have a fixed timeline internally around when to create or generate your strategic plan, that you factor into that process when you will reassess, when you'll kind of go back into internal conversations around what realistically producing a full strategic plan that incorporates all of the aspirations and the public knowledge that you've community aspirations and the public knowledge that you've collected into the strategic plan in a meaningful way. So the cultural change is one piece, but as far as the strategic planning timeline, that it varies from one organization to the next.
Mm-hmm. And I would also just add that be mindful of the resources you have available to you. If you can devote some time to structuring community conversations and just start collecting that public knowledge. You know, from our work in community over the past 30 years, we have an understanding of how change happens in community. This gets to your question of cultural change, and it often starts small in order to go bigger. So as these initial ripples of action spread, momentum builds, and you'll see common purpose emerge both in your community and in your organization. So just something to be aware of as you're working through this process, that it will take those initial, what might seem smaller changes in the beginning in order to create that momentum. But you know, we know that this public knowledge is really critical to creating effective programming. So just get started. I think that's the first step.
Yes.
All right, and Jean asked if you're just getting started with the Harwood practice, there's a learning curve for sure. Oh, Jean's commented, sorry, practice and gifted facilitators to theme the conversations will be key. This is pulling out the common aspirations and concerns the speaker just mentioned. Absolutely, Jean. Thank you for your comment. I think you are right on target. All right, does anyone have any other questions about public knowledge, anything else we talked about today in terms of strategic planning, the 4 steps, anything about the 3 A's or why public knowledge is so important?
And we know the questions and comments have been coming in a little slowly, so no worries.
James, to your question, will all the info be archived? Yes. Glad that you were able to hop on, but if you missed the beginning, after this webinar concludes, we'll be sending a recap email with the recording, the slides, as well as the tools that were mentioned in this webinar, so you can access all of that information.
And someone also asked a question about the narrative. We'll also include the narrative in the PowerPoint so that you'll have that as well. All right, so it looks like we're done with the questions and the comments. We are really grateful for your participation today. We are really excited to get these webinars started. We thank you for bearing with some of our technological challenges here, but we're excited to have you all, and we invite you again to visit our website for more information on the tools that I mentioned today. And please expect after this webinar ends, the recap email with all of the tools that Colleen mentioned, which will be the recording, the PowerPoint, as well as the tools, and we will include the narrative as well. So I'm just going to transition to the final slide here and let Colleen close us out.
Great. So as you'll see, this last slide again are just the updates that we went over at the beginning in terms of other opportunities that you can take advantage of in order to further learn about the practice of turning outward and implement that practice in your library and in your efforts. So just want to point you again to our libraries page on our new website, which we're really excited about. Our next webinar on November 8th, our Public Innovators Lab in St. Louis on October 9th through the 11th. And of course, my contact information is there if you need anything. I also just want to echo Damien's thanks for you all for taking the time to join us here today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this year we are celebrating our 30th anniversary. And in collecting all of the stories and impact that we've seen over the past 30 years, I know I've gained a huge appreciation for the work that you all are doing. And you know, this practice of turning outward has spread to 40 countries and is being used in 50 states. And that's all a testament to the work that you all are doing every day to create positive, lasting change in your community. So really excited to continue working towards creating a better society that creates real, authentic hope and doing that work together. So let us know if you need anything. And as Damien mentioned, we'll send an email with the recording, the recap, all of that. And looking forward to talking with you all again soon.